The slap wasn't the moment that destroyed him. It was the moment everyone started watching, and in a room filled with crystal glasses and quiet million-dollar conversations, silence spread faster than sound ever could as Emily Carter stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, her hand resting instinctively over her 7-month belly, her breathing controlled, measured, almost too calm for what had just happened. And that was the first thing people would remember later, not what he did, but how she didn't react, how she didn't break, how she simply looked at him as if something inside her had finally clicked into place. The ballroom of the Hawthorne Grand shimmered in gold and white, a charity gala for children's hospitals attended by the kind of people who owned buildings instead of renting them, men in tailored tuxedos, women in silk gowns that whispered across marble floors, every detail curated for elegance, control, perfection, and yet in the center of it all stood Richard Hayes, a man who had built his reputation on dominance and precision, now facing the one variable he had never learned to manage, Emily's silence. A glass slipped somewhere in the crowd, the faint clink echoing like a signal no one had agreed to send, phones lowered at first out of instinct, then slowly, subtly raised again, because something about this moment felt bigger than discomfort. It felt like the beginning of a story people would want proof they had witnessed. Emily's lips parted slightly, not to speak, but to breathe, to steady herself, the faint metallic taste in her mouth grounding her in reality as her baby shifted beneath her hand, a small movement, but enough to remind her what mattered, enough to anchor her in a room designed to make people forget themselves. Across from her, Richard adjusted his cufflinks, the same way he did in boardrooms when negotiations turned tense, as if this, too, was just another situation to control, his voice low but sharp as it cut through the stillness, telling her to apologize, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean in, waiting for the familiar pattern to repeat, the obedient response, the lowered gaze, the restoration of order. But Emily didn't move, and that hesitation, barely a second, maybe 2, felt longer than anything that had come before it, because people who knew power could recognize when it shifted, even before it fully revealed itself. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered, someone else inhaled sharply, and the music, soft piano that had filled the room moments ago, seemed suddenly distant, irrelevant, like background noise in a scene no longer about celebration. Emily's eyes lifted, not in defiance, not in anger, but in something far more unsettling, clarity, as if she had finally seen the truth of her life from the outside looking in, and once seen, it could never be unseen. Richard's jaw tightened, his control slipping just enough to be noticed by those paying close attention, and that was when it happened, not another action, not another word, but something quieter, something more dangerous. The realization spreading through the room that this moment was no longer his to command, that whatever came next would not follow his script. And as the air itself seemed to hold its breath, a voice near the stage cut cleanly through the tension, polished and precise, announcing that the host of the evening had just arrived, and without warning, every eye began to turn away from Richard Hayes, because in rooms like this, attention was the first currency to shift, and once lost, it rarely returned. The shift was subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm, as conversations that had already died now refused to return and attention moved with quiet precision toward the entrance where the tall double doors stood closed for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary, long enough to build anticipation in a room trained to recognize importance before it was announced, and then they opened with controlled elegance. Not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to reveal a figure stepping inside with the kind of presence that did not need introduction. A man in a perfectly cut black suit, his pace unhurried, his gaze steady, each step measured against the polished marble floor that reflected both light and power, and as he moved forward, staff members adjusted instinctively, guests straightened their posture, and even the musicians seemed to hesitate before continuing. Because Alexander Cole did not enter rooms, he recalibrated them. Emily felt it before she fully saw him. A familiarity that did not come from memory alone but from something deeper, something that had once felt like certainty, and for a brief second her fingers pressed slightly firmer against her belly, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in recognition, as if two timelines had just collided in the same space. Across the room, Richard followed the direction of everyone's attention, his expression shifting from irritation to calculation as he registered the change in energy. Because men like him understood hierarchy instantly. And whatever control he believed he held moments ago was now being quietly reevaluated by every person watching. The announcer's voice carried smoothly through the speakers, welcoming the host of the evening, emphasizing his contribution, his vision, his influence in shaping not just the event but the entire foundation behind it, and while the words were polished and expected, they barely mattered compared to the visual truth unfolding in front of them. Alexander's eyes moved across the room once, not searching, not scanning, simply acknowledging. Until they landed on Emily, and in that instant the world seemed to narrow to a single point of connection that no one else could fully understand, because what passed between them was not surprise, it was confirmation. Emily did not step forward, did not react outwardly, but something in her posture changed, a quiet alignment of shoulders, a steadiness in her breathing that replaced the fragile tension from moments before, and those closest to her could feel it even if they could not explain it. A woman near the front whispered his name, another guest nodded with recognition, and within seconds the room had collectively adjusted its understanding of who truly held power here. Because while Richard Hayes was known, respected, even feared in certain circles, Alexander Cole operated on a level that redefined the scale entirely. Richard cleared his throat softly, a reflex more than a strategy. Attempting to reassert presence without drawing attention to the fact that it had already slipped. But the timing betrayed him, because just as he began to speak, Alexander reached the center of the room and paused, not dramatically, simply with intention, allowing silence to settle fully before acknowledging the crowd with a slight nod, and it was in that pause, that controlled stillness, that the balance shifted completely. Emily watched him without blinking, the past threading itself quietly into the present. Recalling a voice from years ago that had once promised protection not through force but through inevitability, and now, standing in a room where everything had been designed to display wealth and influence, she understood something far more important than either. Some people did not need to raise their voice to change a story, they only needed to arrive at the right moment. And as Alexander's gaze remained steady on her for one fraction longer than necessary before turning outward to address the room, every person there felt it without knowing why. That whatever came next had already been decided long before tonight ever began. Alexander's voice did not rise, yet it carried effortlessly across the ballroom, smooth and deliberate, the kind of voice that did not compete for attention because it assumed it already had it, and as he thanked the guests for their presence, and spoke briefly about the cause, his words were polished, expected, almost routine, but beneath that surface something else moved, something quieter, something sharper. And those who listened closely could feel it in the pauses between sentences, in the way his gaze occasionally returned to one point in the room without naming it. Emily remained exactly where she stood, but the space around her had changed. People who had been watching her with curiosity now stepped slightly aside, not out of pity, but out of instinct, as if recognizing that she was no longer at the center of something uncomfortable but at the edge of something significant. Richard shifted his weight, adjusting his posture as though preparing to re-enter control of the situation, his mind moving quickly through possibilities, explanations, strategies, but each option seemed to dissolve the moment he looked again toward Alexander, because there was no invitation, no acknowledgement that allowed him to step forward without consequence. The mistress beside him, who moments earlier had held a confident smile, now glanced between the two men with uncertainty. Sensing a dynamic she could not fully interpret, her confidence thinning not because of anything said, but because of what remained unsaid. Alexander finished his opening remarks with a brief nod, the room responding with polite applause that felt more like a release of tension than celebration, and as the sound faded, he did not step back, did not hand the moment away, instead he turned slightly, his attention aligning once again with Emily, and this time there was no ambiguity, no subtlety, just a clear, deliberate acknowledgement that redirected every eye in the room back to her. Emily felt it fully now, the weight of attention returning but transformed, no longer sharp or invasive, but steady, almost protective, and for the first time that evening she moved, not quickly, Not dramatically, just a single step forward that placed her firmly within the center of the moment rather than on its edge. A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, people recalibrating their understanding in real time. Because the story they thought they were witnessing no longer matched what was unfolding. Richard's voice came again. Quieter this time, edged with something that sounded less like authority and more like urgency, calling her name as if trying to anchor her back into the role he expected. But Emily did not turn toward him, did not acknowledge the pull, her focus fixed ahead as if the past few minutes had drawn a line she would not cross again. Alexander took one step closer, closing a distance that had been measured not in feet but in years. And when he spoke again, it was not to the room, but to her, his tone unchanged yet carrying a weight that only she seemed to fully understand, asking if she was all right in a way that was neither performative nor intrusive, simply certain. The question lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and in that space, Emily exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to release something she had been holding for far too long, her answer quiet but clear, not defined by what had happened earlier, but by what she had already decided. Around them, the room remained still, because even without raised voices or dramatic gestures, everyone present could sense that the balance had shifted beyond repair, that whatever came next would not be about recovering control, but about revealing truth. And in that moment, Richard Hayes realized something he had never needed to consider before. That influence built on perception could disappear the instant someone else chose to redefine the narrative, in front of witnesses who would never forget what they had just seen. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt controlled, as if every person in the room understood they were witnessing something that would not be repeated, and Alexander allowed that silence to settle fully before shifting his attention outward again, not away from Emily, but expanding the moment to include everyone present, his voice calm and even as he addressed the audience once more, thanking them for supporting the foundation and then, almost seamlessly, transitioning into something less expected, something that sounded like a clarification rather than an announcement, explaining that partnerships, like reputations, were built on trust and that trust required transparency. A few heads tilted slightly, subtle reactions from those who recognized the shift in tone. Because this was no longer a standard gala speech, this was something else. Something precise. Richard felt it immediately, the faint tightening in his chest not from fear, but from recognition, because he had spent years in rooms like this learning how power moved beneath polite conversation, and now that same current was turning toward him. Alexander continued, his words measured, referencing recent evaluations of business alignments connected to the foundation, noting that certain affiliations no longer met the standards required moving forward, and though no names had been spoken yet, the implication began to ripple through the room with quiet clarity. A man near the front adjusted his glasses. Another guest glanced toward Richard with a look that had already begun to change, because in circles like these, distance could form in seconds once doubt entered the equation. Emily stood still, listening, not with surprise, but with a quiet understanding that this moment had been building long before tonight, that what felt sudden to everyone else had been inevitable from the start. Richard stepped forward slightly, attempting to intercept the narrative before it solidified, his voice controlled but edged with urgency as he addressed Alexander directly, reminding him of their ongoing projects, their mutual interests, framing their connection as established and stable. But the words felt thinner than he intended, because they were no longer supported by the room's belief. Alexander turned his gaze toward him, not sharply, not aggressively, simply acknowledging his presence with the same calm certainty he had carried since entering, and when he spoke, he did not contradict Richard, he did not argue, he simply clarified, stating that effective immediately, all formal partnerships between his organization and Hayes Holdings were under review and suspended pending further investigation, the phrasing precise, legal, leaving no space for interpretation. A quiet murmur moved through the guests, not loud enough to break decorum, but enough to signal that the shift had completed, that what had once been assumed secure was now openly uncertain. The mistress beside Richard took a small step back without realizing it, her posture adjusting as though distance might protect her from being associated with what was unfolding, and that single movement, almost invisible, said more than any words could have. Emily watched without turning her head, her focus steady, because for her, this was not about public consequences or financial structures, it was about something far simpler and far more final. The realization that the version of her life she had been holding on to no longer existed. Alexander's attention returned to her once more, and though he did not speak again immediately, the space between them carried a different kind of weight now, not unresolved, not uncertain, but clear, as if everything that needed to be understood had already been decided. Richard opened his mouth to respond, to reclaim, to reframe, but no words came fast enough to catch up with what had already been set in motion. And in that moment he understood something he had never had to face before. That control was not about how loudly you spoke, or how firmly you stood, it was about whether anyone still believed in the version of reality you were trying to maintain, and as the room continued to watch in complete silence, that belief had already begun to disappear. No one moved to fill the silence, because there was nothing left to smooth over, no polite version of events that could restore what had already been undone, and Emily felt it settle fully, not as pressure, but as release, as if the invisible weight she had carried for months had finally shifted off her shoulders without needing to be acknowledged. Richard's eyes moved quickly across the room, searching for alignment, for any sign that someone might step forward, that someone might reinforce the version of reality he had always controlled, but what he found instead were careful distances, subtle turns of the body, conversations that did not resume, and faces that no longer reflected certainty but calculation, because in a room like this, people did not need explanations to understand when a position had weakened. He spoke again, this time more directly, attempting to reframe the situation as temporary, procedural, something that could be resolved with time and discussion, but even as the words left his mouth, they seemed to lose shape, because they no longer matched what everyone had just witnessed. Emily finally turned her head slightly, not toward him, but enough to acknowledge his presence as something separate from her own path, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment he was still trying to hold on to. The baby shifted again beneath her hand, a steady reminder that her decisions now carried forward into something larger than this room, larger than this night. And that realization grounded her in a way nothing else could. Alexander remained composed, allowing Richard's words to pass without interruption, without visible reaction, because power did not require immediate response when the outcome was already clear, and when he finally spoke again, it was not to challenge, not to argue, but to conclude, stating that formal notifications would be delivered in writing and that all further communication would proceed through legal channels, his tone unchanged, professional, final. The phrasing closed the space completely, leaving no room for negotiation. In front of an audience that had already drawn its own conclusions, a few guests exchanged glances, others subtly shifted their stance, aligning themselves with what was now evident, because reputation in this world moved quickly, and no one wanted to remain attached to a narrative that had already begun to collapse. The mistress stepped back another inch, her earlier confidence replaced by careful neutrality, as if trying to minimize her visibility in a moment that no longer favored proximity. Emily inhaled slowly, then took another step forward, not toward Alexander, not toward Richard, but forward in her own direction, a movement so simple yet so definitive that it redirected the entire emotional center of the room. Heels clicked softly against marble, steady, unhurried, each step reinforcing what no words needed to explain, that she was no longer part of the dynamic that had just unraveled. As she passed beside Richard, she did not look at him, did not pause, did not acknowledge the tension he carried, because acknowledgement would have implied connection, and that connection had already ended in everything that mattered. Alexander watched her move, his expression unchanged but his attention unwavering, not as someone reclaiming something lost, but as someone recognizing a decision that had already been made without him. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened quietly, staff stepping aside without instruction, and Emily walked through them into the cooler air beyond, leaving behind the gold light, the whispers, and the fragile structures of power that had just shifted in front of witnesses who would remember every detail. Inside the room, Richard remained where he stood, surrounded by people who no longer stood with him, and in that stillness he faced the one outcome he had never prepared for, not loss of money, not loss of status, but the loss of control over how his story would be told from this moment forward. Because once a room stops believing you, there is nothing left to command. The night air outside the Hawthorne Grand felt different, cooler, quieter, untouched by the tension that still lingered inside, and as the doors closed behind her, Emily slowed her steps for the first time, not out of hesitation, but because she no longer needed to move with urgency, her breath steady as she inhaled deeply, the faint scent of rain on concrete grounding her in a reality that finally felt her own. The city stretched out before her, lights glowing in neat lines, distant traffic humming like a constant reminder that life continued beyond any single moment, and for a brief second she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to absorb the stillness she had not felt in a long time. Behind her, the faint echo of voices resumed inside the building, muted and indistinct, as if the world she had just left was already beginning to rewrite itself without her in it. She adjusted her coat slightly over her shoulders, her hand returning instinctively to her belly, feeling the gentle movement beneath, a quiet reassurance that she was not alone, that whatever came next would not be faced the way everything before had been. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, measured and familiar, but she did not turn immediately, because she already knew who it was, the same awareness that had settled in her the moment he walked into the ballroom now guiding her without effort. Alexander stopped a few feet away. Not close enough to intrude, not distant enough to seem detached. Respecting a boundary that had not been spoken but clearly understood, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence between them different from the one inside, not heavy, not tense, but open, as if it allowed space for something new rather than holding on to what had already passed. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, no longer addressing a room, no longer carrying authority, just direct, asking if she needed anything, if she was safe, if there was somewhere she wanted to go. The question simple, grounded, free of expectation. Emily turned then, meeting his gaze fully, and there was no shock, no confusion, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. The years between them no longer filled with unanswered questions but with clarity that did not require explanation. She shook her head slightly, not rejecting the offer, but answering honestly, her voice calm as she said she was fine, that she would be fine, and for the first time those words did not feel like something she had to convince herself of. Alexander studied her for a second longer, as if confirming that what she said matched what he saw, then nodded once, accepting her answer without pushing further. Because understanding when not to step in was as important as knowing when to act. A car pulled up along the curb, the driver stepping out briefly before waiting by the door, and Emily glanced toward it before looking back at Alexander, a small pause passing between them that carried more weight than any conversation could have, a recognition of what they had been, what they were not, and what did not need to be decided tonight. She offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of gratitude, not of nostalgia, but of closure, then turned and walked toward the car, each step steady, unhurried, unburdened. Alexander remained where he stood, watching her leave without calling her back, without altering the path she had chosen, because some returns were not about reclaiming the past, but about witnessing someone finally step into their own future. The car door closed softly, the engine started, and as it pulled away into the city lights, the night continued as it always had, but for Emily Carter, something fundamental had shifted, not in the world around her, but in the way she would move through it from this moment on, because power was never about who stood beside you. It was about knowing when you no longer needed anyone to stand in front of you at all. By morning, the story had already changed shape, no longer confined to a single room or a single moment, but spreading quietly through conversations, messages, and headlines that did not need to exaggerate because the truth itself was enough. And while the city woke up to another ordinary day, names like Richard Hayes and Alexander Cole moved through different circles with very different meanings attached to them. Emily sat by the window of her apartment, the early light filtering through sheer curtains, her coffee untouched on the table beside her, as she watched the traffic below move in steady lines, each car heading somewhere, each person carrying their own version of urgency. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel pulled by any of it. Her phone buzzed once, then again, notifications stacking one after another, messages from numbers she recognized and many she did not, some asking if she was all right, others offering support, and a few simply trying to understand what had happened, but she did not reach for the device immediately. Because the outside world could wait, and right now, she needed the quiet. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention, softer than she remembered, not because anything had changed overnight, but because something had finally settled inside her, a stillness that replaced the constant tension she had carried without realizing how heavy it had become. Across the city, Richard sat in his office, the same office that had once felt like the center of control. Now surrounded by screens displaying updates he could not manage, emails marked urgent, calls he could not ignore. And for the first time in years, he found himself reacting instead of directing, each new message reinforcing the same reality, that the narrative had moved beyond him, that decisions were being made without his input, and that the certainty he had built his reputation on was no longer being reflected back at him. His assistant stood at the door, waiting for instructions that did not come as quickly as they used to. Because even simple responses now required recalculation, and the silence in that office carried a different weight than the silence in the ballroom, this one filled with consequences that would unfold over time rather than all at once. Back in her apartment, Emily finally reached for her phone, scrolling through the messages with a calm detachment, not dismissing them, but no longer defined by them. And when she came across one from an unknown number that simply read, "You handled yourself with grace," she paused for a moment, not because she needed validation, but because the word grace felt accurate in a way she had not expected. She placed the phone down again and stood slowly, moving through her space with a quiet purpose, opening the window slightly to let in the cool morning air, the sounds of the city rising up in a soft, constant rhythm that felt grounding rather than overwhelming. Somewhere not too far away, Alexander reviewed documents in his own office, his actions already moving into the next phase, meetings scheduled, decisions finalized. But even in the precision of his work, there was a brief moment where his attention shifted, not to the events of the night, but to the image of Emily walking forward without hesitation, a detail that stayed with him not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had always known about her. And as the day continued, unfolding in its usual patterns, one thing had quietly changed. For everyone involved, not in a way that could be measured in numbers or contracts, but in the understanding that power, once revealed for what it truly was, could never return to the illusion it once depended on. And for Emily Carter, that understanding was no longer something she observed from a distance, it was something she now carried with her, steady and unshakable, into whatever came next. The following days did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet, methodical shift that unfolded in boardrooms, inboxes, and private conversations where decisions were made without cameras or applause. And for Emily, that distance from the chaos became its own kind of clarity as she moved through her routine with a steadiness that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. The apartment felt different now. Not because anything had physically changed, but because every corner of it reflected a version of her that was no longer waiting, no longer negotiating for space within someone else's expectations. And as she folded a small stack of baby clothes on the couch, her movements were deliberate, unhurried, grounded in a future that belonged entirely to her. Her phone buzzed again on the table, this time with a call from her attorney, a conversation she had been expecting, and when she answered, her voice was calm, direct, discussing next steps with a level of focus that would have surprised anyone who had only seen her a week ago, because there was no hesitation in her tone, no second-guessing, only clarity. Across town, Richard's world continued to contract in ways he could not immediately control, meetings cancelled, calls returned with delays instead of urgency, and people who once aligned themselves closely with him now responding with careful distance, their language measured, their commitments vague, because in his world, perception was currency, and once that currency weakened, everything attached to it followed. He sat at his desk longer than usual, staring at documents that now required explanations he could not simplify, realizing that rebuilding would not be immediate, that this was not a situation he could resolve with a single decisive move, and that understanding settled heavily, not as panic, but as a slow recognition of consequence. Emily stepped outside later that afternoon, the sun warmer than it had been the night of the gala, casting a softer light across the streets, and as she walked down the block, passing familiar storefronts and unfamiliar faces, she noticed something small but significant. She was not watching herself through the eyes of others anymore, not adjusting her posture, not anticipating reactions, just moving as she was, present and unguarded. A passerby held the door open for her at a cafe, offering a simple smile. And she returned it without hesitation, a normal interaction that felt new in its simplicity. Inside, she ordered tea, choosing a table by the window, the same position she had chosen countless times before. But now without the weight of waiting for messages or checking the time, just sitting, just breathing, just being. Somewhere else in the city, Alexander continued his work with the same precision as always, but there was a subtle difference in his awareness. A quiet acknowledgement that some outcomes were not about intervention but about timing, about knowing when to step in and when to step back, and he had done both, exactly when it mattered. As evening approached, the city lights began to return one by one, reflecting off glass buildings and passing cars, creating a familiar rhythm that did not change for anyone, and yet for Emily, everything had shifted, not because her circumstances were perfect, not because the future was fully defined, but because for the first time it was hers to define without compromise. She walked back home at her own pace, her hand resting lightly over her belly, the movement beneath it steady and reassuring, and in that quiet, steady rhythm, there was something stronger than anything that had unfolded in the ballroom days before, something that did not need witnesses or validation, because it was not about proving anything to anyone, it was about finally understanding that dignity, once chosen, does not ask for permission to stay. The week unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its stability, as if the chaos that had once defined Emily's days had been replaced by something quieter, something deliberate, and while the outside world continued to process what had happened, she found herself no longer reacting to it but simply moving forward, step by step, choice by choice. The legal process began without drama, documents reviewed, terms discussed, timelines established, and each conversation reinforced the same reality that had already taken root inside her, that this was not an ending she needed to fear but a transition she was already prepared for. Her attorney spoke with confidence, outlining options, explaining protections, ensuring that everything would be handled with care, and Emily listened closely, asking the right questions, not out of uncertainty but out of ownership, because this was no longer something happening to her. It was something she was actively shaping, across the city. Richard continued to navigate a landscape that no longer responded to him the way it once had, meetings rescheduled instead of confirmed, partners requesting clarifications that hinted at hesitation, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in tone from those who had once aligned themselves closely with his success. And while nothing collapsed all at once, the slow erosion of certainty proved far more difficult to counter than any single event could have been. Emily, meanwhile, found comfort in the ordinary details that had once been overshadowed: morning light across the kitchen counter, the quiet hum of appliances, the steady rhythm of her own breathing as she prepared for each day without the weight of anticipation or anxiety. One afternoon, she opened a small box she had not touched in years: letters, photographs, fragments of a life that felt distant now, and among them she found a note written in a familiar hand. Simple, direct, promising that she would never have to become smaller to fit into someone else's world, and as she read it again, she realized that the promise had never been about someone else protecting her, it had always been about her recognizing her own worth. She placed the note back carefully, not as something she needed to hold on to, but as something she had already internalized. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the city, Emily stood by her window once more. Her reflection clearer now, not because anything had changed physically, but because she was no longer looking for confirmation in it. She simply saw herself as she was, steady, capable, enough. Somewhere else, Alexander received updates that confirmed what he had already anticipated: decisions moving forward, structures realigning, but his attention lingered briefly on something that could not be measured in reports or outcomes: the image of Emily choosing her own direction without hesitation. A detail that stayed with him not as a responsibility, but as a quiet certainty that some stories did not need to be guided to reach their rightful conclusion, As night settled over the city once again, lights flickering on in windows across the skyline, Emily turned away from the glass, moving through her space with calm intention, preparing for tomorrow not as something to brace for, but as something to meet on her own terms, and in that quiet, unremarkable moment, there was a truth more powerful than anything that had unfolded under chandeliers and watchful eyes, that the real shift had never been about who stood beside her, but about the moment she stopped standing in a place that no longer deserved her presence, and once that decision was made, everything else simply followed. Time moved forward with a quiet certainty that no longer needed to prove itself, and as the final papers were signed on a clear Tuesday morning, the process that had once felt overwhelming now felt almost procedural, as if it had simply been waiting for Emily to arrive at this exact point with the clarity she now carried. The office was calm, neutral in its design, sunlight filtering through wide windows. The faint scent of paper and polished wood grounding the moment in something real and tangible, and as she placed the pen down after her final signature, there was no dramatic shift, no sudden wave of emotion, just a steady, unmistakable sense of completion. Her attorney reviewed the documents once more, offering a small, professional nod that confirmed what had already been understood, that everything had been handled, that the next chapter was no longer theoretical, it was official. Emily thanked her quietly, her voice even, not weighed down by what had ended, but anchored in what had begun. Outside, the city carried on as it always did, people moving through crosswalks, taxis passing in steady lines, the rhythm of life uninterrupted, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the air felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because she no longer carried anything that belonged to the past. Her phone vibrated briefly, a message notification appearing on the screen, and when she glanced down, she recognized the name immediately, Alexander, the message simple, not intrusive, just a single line asking if everything had gone smoothly. She read it once, then again, considering the words not for their meaning, but for what they represented, a connection that existed without pressure, without expectation, and after a moment she typed a brief reply, "Yes, thank you," before slipping the phone back into her bag, the exchange complete, balanced, exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. Across town, Richard sat in a smaller office than the one he once occupied, reviewing new proposals that carried different terms, different expectations, and for the first time, he read them carefully, not assuming, not controlling, but adapting. Because the version of certainty he had relied on was no longer available to him, and while his world had not ended, it had changed in ways that required him to recognize something he had never valued before, that respect could not be maintained without integrity. Emily walked down the street at her own pace, the sound of her steps steady against the pavement, her hand resting lightly over her belly as she moved through the afternoon light, the future no longer something distant or uncertain, but something present, something she was already living. She paused briefly at a storefront window, catching her reflection once more, and this time, there was no searching in her eyes, no question, just recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of who she had become through everything she had faced. She continued walking, blending into the movement of the city, no longer defined by a single moment, no longer shaped by someone else's choices, but guided by her own. And as the sun began its slow descent across the skyline, casting a warm glow over everything it touched, there was a finality in the simplicity of her steps, a truth that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it was evident in every part of how she moved forward. Some men spend years building power they believe cannot be taken from them, only to discover too late that the one thing they never learned to value was the dignity of the person standing beside them, and when that dignity walks away, it does not leave quietly, it takes with it everything that was never truly earned in the first place. The days that followed no longer felt like a recovery, but like a continuation of something that had finally been set in the right direction, and as Emily prepared the last few things in her apartment, folding clothes into a small overnight bag and organizing documents neatly on the kitchen counter, there was no sense of urgency in her movements, only intention. As if each action carried a quiet understanding of where she was headed next. The nursery corner she had begun setting up by the window now looked complete in a way that was simple but certain, soft light, clean lines, nothing excessive, nothing performative, just a space built for care and calm, and as she adjusted a small blanket over the crib, her hand lingered there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of presence, fully aware of the life she was preparing to welcome without the weight of uncertainty that had once surrounded it. Her phone remained silent on the table, not because the world had stopped reaching out, but because she had chosen when and how to engage with it, a boundary that felt natural now rather than forced. Across the city, Richard sat alone in a conference room that echoed more than it used to, the long table in front of him no longer filled with advisors or partners waiting for his direction, but with neatly arranged folders that required his attention in a different way, and as he reviewed them, there was a noticeable shift in how he approached each decision, slower, more deliberate, as if understanding for the first time that control without awareness had led him exactly to this point. The absence of constant affirmation around him did not break him, but it reshaped him, forcing him into a quieter version of himself that had to learn rather than command. Back in her apartment, Emily picked up her keys, pausing briefly at the door, her eyes moving once across the space she had lived in through so many versions of herself, and instead of feeling attached, she felt complete, as if she was leaving nothing unfinished behind. Outside, the afternoon air carried a light breeze, the kind that signaled change without announcing it, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the world did not react, it did not pause or acknowledge her transition, and that was exactly what made it real, because this was not a moment for an audience, it was a moment for her. A car waited at the curb, not extravagant, not symbolic, just a practical next step, and as she approached it, her reflection passed briefly across the window glass, steady, composed, fully aligned with the direction she had chosen. She placed her bag inside, then settled into the seat, her hand once again resting gently over her belly, the movement beneath it calm and reassuring, a quiet reminder that everything ahead would be built on something stronger than anything she had left behind. Somewhere else in the city, Alexander stood by his office window, looking out over the skyline without focusing on any one building, his thoughts not fixed on outcomes or strategies, but on the simple awareness that some moments did not require action to matter, they simply required presence, and he had been present when it counted. The city continued its rhythm as the car pulled away from the curb, blending into the flow of traffic, carrying Emily forward into a future that no longer needed to be imagined or defended, only lived, and in that steady movement, without spectacle or announcement, a truth settled fully into place. That the strongest kind of justice does not always arrive as punishment for others, but as freedom for the one who chooses to walk away and never look back, because some men lose everything they built just to understand too late that the one thing they could never replace was the dignity they failed to recognize when it stood right in front of them. The road stretched forward without ceremony, just another lane among many, yet for Emily it marked a distance far greater than miles, as the car moved steadily through the city and then beyond its edges where buildings softened into quieter neighborhoods and open skies began to replace the crowded skyline. She rested back into the seat, her gaze drifting to the passing scenery, not searching for anything, simply observing, allowing each moment to arrive without needing to measure it against the past. The driver kept his focus on the road, the hum of the engine consistent, almost soothing, creating a rhythm that matched the calm she now carried within herself. Her phone remained still beside her, no longer a source of urgency or interruption, just an object among others, and in that silence she found something rare, the ability to sit with her own thoughts without distraction, without pressure to respond or explain. Her hand moved gently over her belly again, feeling the steady presence beneath. A quiet reassurance that her life was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she was building, step by step, choice by choice. Hours passed without urgency, the sun shifting slowly across the sky until it dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the road ahead, and as the car turned onto a quieter street lined with trees and modest homes, there was a sense of arrival that did not need to be announced. The house that came into view was simple, not grand, not designed to impress, but welcoming in a way that felt immediate, its porch light already on as if anticipating her presence without needing confirmation. The car came to a gentle stop, and for a moment Emily remained seated, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, Recognizing that this threshold marked something final and something new at the same time, she stepped out slowly, the air cooler here, carrying the faint scent of grass and evening, a contrast to the polished atmosphere she had left behind days ago. The door opened before she reached it, a woman standing there with a warm expression, someone who did not ask questions, did not need explanations, simply stepping aside to let her in as if she had always belonged there. Inside, the space was quiet, lived in, grounded, and as Emily crossed the threshold, the world she had left behind felt further away than it actually was, not because it no longer existed, but because it no longer held any power over her. She set her bag down gently, taking in the room not as a visitor, but as someone beginning again, and for the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like something uncertain or distant, it felt present, tangible, already unfolding. Somewhere far behind her, the city continued its constant motion, deals being made, reputations shifting. People adapting to the changes that had been set in motion, and among them, Richard continued to navigate a world that no longer bent to his expectations, learning in silence what he had once ignored in noise. But here, in this quiet space, none of that reached her, none of it mattered in the way it once had, because the only thing that carried forward was what she chose to bring with her, and everything else had been left behind the moment she walked away. She moved toward the window, looking out at the dimming sky. Her reflection faint in the glass, steady, whole, and without needing to say anything aloud, she understood the final truth that had taken shape through everything she had endured, that some endings do not come with confrontation or closure from others, they come with a single decision made in clarity. And once that decision is honored, there is nothing left to resolve, only a life waiting to be lived on your own terms, and that is the kind of ending that no one can take from you once you have chosen it. Morning arrived gently, without urgency or interruption, light filtering through the window in soft layers that settled across the room as if it had always belonged there, and Emily woke to a quiet that did not feel empty but full of possibility, full of space that no longer needed to be negotiated or defended. She lay still for a moment, her hand resting over her belly, feeling the steady, reassuring movement beneath, a rhythm that grounded her more than anything else ever had, and as she breathed in slowly, there was no tension waiting beneath the surface, no anticipation of conflict, just a calm awareness that this day, like the ones to come, would unfold on her terms. She rose without hesitation, moving through the house with a quiet confidence that had replaced the careful restraint she once carried, each step deliberate but unburdened. As if she had finally aligned with something that had always been waiting for her to recognize it. The kitchen filled with the simple sounds of morning, water running, a kettle warming, sunlight catching the edges of clean surfaces, and none of it needed to be extraordinary to feel meaningful, because for the first time, ordinary was enough. Outside, the neighborhood moved at its own pace, a car passing slowly, a door closing somewhere down the street, life continuing without spectacle, and in that simplicity, Emily found something stronger than any moment of public attention, something lasting. Her phone remained untouched on the counter, not ignored, but no longer central, because whatever messages waited there did not define her next step. She did. Across the distance, the world she had once been part of continued to adjust, reputations recalibrating, alliances shifting, lessons unfolding in ways that could not be reversed, and while Richard remained within that world, navigating its new expectations with a quieter understanding than before, his story no longer intersected with hers in any way that mattered. Emily stepped outside onto the small porch, the air crisp and clear, carrying the faint scent of morning dew, and as she looked out across the quiet street, there was no need to measure where she stood against where she had been, because the distance was already understood, somewhere in the city. Alexander paused briefly between meetings, his attention momentarily drawn not to numbers or outcomes, but to the simple certainty that some choices, once made, reshaped everything without needing further action, and that certainty carried its own kind of respect. Back on the porch, Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to feel the moment fully, the calm, the clarity, the absence of anything she needed to prove, and when she opened them again, her gaze was steady, forward. Unshaken, she turned back inside, the door closing softly behind her, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a life moving forward without needing to look back, because everything that had once held her in place had already been left behind, and in that quiet, unremarkable morning, there was a truth that required no explanation, no witness, no confirmation, that some men lose everything they built just to understand too late what a woman's dignity is worth. But a woman who chooses herself does not lose anything at all. She simply stops carrying what was never hers to begin with. And that is how real power begins, not in the moment it is seen, but in the moment it is quietly, undeniably chosen.